Good evening and a very warm welcome to our panel discussion, Modernism in Process, Bauhaus in Calcutta 1922 and in Dessau 2013. It is the second of 4 conversations reflecting different aspects of the Bauhaus, the famous art and design school and movement at the beginning of the 20th century. This series of events functions as a prelude to the exhibition Responding to Bauhaus Imaginista Collected Research at the Indian Museum, which will be presented by the Indian Museum, the Ministry of Culture, the Government of India, and the Goethe-Institut Max Müller-Bhavan, Calcutta, and which will open this fall in Calcutta. Bauhaus Imaginista, curated by Marion van Osten and Grant Watson, was a major research and exhibition project focusing on the international reception of the Bauhaus and how it had been influential on and at the same time influenced by art and design movements worldwide. The collected archive material from this exhibition is the core of the Calcutta presentation, and it will be contextualized by a newly commissioned architectural installation by the Indian artist Sanchayan Ghosh, who has been invited to respond to this archive and connect it to the setting of the India Museum and to its collection. Responding to Bauhaus Imaginista highlights the transnational perspective on the history of modernist art and design and the artistic and intellectual affinities between Germany and India, respectively West Bengal and Calcutta. Between Western modernism searching for spiritual and artistic renewal after the First World War and Indian artists striving for cultural emancipation in late colonial India. Today's panel will reflect on an exhibition presented in Dessau in 2013, which sought to reconstruct and contextualize the 1922 show in Calcutta, and it will explore moments of shared modernism. We have 3 distinguished guests today, Professor Partha Mitter, Dr. Regina Bittner, who was one of the curators of the 2013 exhibition in Dessau and also part of the team of Bauhaus Imaginista, and Professor Parul Dave-Mukherji, who will function as a speaker as well as a moderator. Before I briefly introduce Professor Mukherjee, I would like to hand over to our dear partner, the acting director of the Indian Museum, Mr. Arjit Dutta Chaudhary, to say a few words. Mr. Chaudhary, over to you.
Thank you, Esther. Extremely grateful to Goethe-Institut for joining hands with Indian Museum for this exhibition, Bauhaus Imaginista, which is, I would say, the last stage of installation. Extremely grateful to Mr. Sarkar, who has been continuously monitoring the work which is going on in Indian Museum, along with the team both from Santiniketan as well as from Indian Museum. In fact, this lecture is what I have been looking forward to a long time. Bauhaus in Calcutta 1922 and in Dessau 2013. Yeah, this is, I was very keen to know more, so as I was saying some time back. This is some new knowledge which we will gain through this discussion, and I look forward to a very enlightening evening today. Extremely thankful to all the 3 speakers, Regina Bittner, Dr. Partha Mitter, and Dr. Parul Mukherjee for being with us here today. Thank you so much, and I'll not like to waste much time. I'll hand it over back to Esther so that we can proceed with today's discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chaudhary, for your words. And yes, you're right. We are all looking forward to this discussion. But first, let me introduce Professor Parul Dave-Mukherjee. She's a professor of visual studies and art history at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She holds a PhD from Oxford University and has a research interest in pre-modern Indian aesthetics and modern and contemporary Indian and Asian art. She has held fellowships in the United States, in Heidelberg, in Germany, in London, and in Florence. Currently, she is co-editing with Partha Mitter and Rakhi Balaram a comprehensive history of modern and contemporary Indian art in a volume titled 20th Century Indian Art. This will definitely be a book to read and enjoy once it will be released. Professor Mukherjee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frau Astrid-Weger, for your warm welcome and generous introduction and placing today's panel in a meaningful context. I wish to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel. Although I'm more of an interloper, neither was I involved in the curatorial project, nor have I written specifically on the Bauhaus movement, even if I've been interested in the project of the global art history. So I'll stand in here for the spectator and be an avid listener as I moderate the session, which has, as you all can see, two brilliant speakers, the curator herself, Regina Bittner, and art historian, Professor Partha Mitter, who has been at the forefront of theorizing modernism in India. As the title of this session indicates, modernism is not only a dynamic process, but it has a much wider spatial reach in the colonial world. More recent scholarship has highlighted this wider geography of modern art under various conceptual frameworks like transculturalism, hybridity, cultural translation, multiple modernities, decolonization, and the global model, amongst many other such concepts. So along with this broad spatiality of the modern, we also have to deal with multiple temporalities, which is again annotated in the title of this session, Modernism in Process. Bauhaus in Calcutta, 1922, and in Dessau, 2013. And let us add our very present moment, 2021, when we're looking back at these earlier moments. So there are at least 3 time frames right before us and layers of mediation. So with this brief introduction to the theme, let us turn to our speakers who have deeply meditated on these very questions. May I introduce our first speaker, Regina Bittner. She is a cultural anthropologist and a curator. She has studied cultural theory and art history at Dessau University and received her doctorate from the Institute for European Ethnology at the Humboldt-Universität Berlin. As head of the Academy of Bauhaus Dessau Foundation, she curates and teaches postgraduate and cross-disciplinary programs on transcultural modernism in design and architecture research. She has been the deputy director of the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation since 2009. Our most recent curatorial project include Substrata Bauhaus, the collection, the permanent exhibition in the Bauhaus Museum Dessau. The research interests combine cultural anthropological approaches in architecture and design studies with questions of decolonization, critical heritage, and its mediation in teaching and curatorial practice. Our most recent curatorial publication and projects include Design Rehearsal, Conversations about Bauhaus Lesson Together with Katja Klaus, 2019, Craft Becomes Modern. The Bauhaus in the Making, which was in collaboration with René Part 2017. In Reserve, the Household, Historic Models and Contemporary Positions from Bauhaus. This was in collaboration with Elka Krasny and the Bauhaus in Calcutta, an encounter of the cosmopolitan avant-garde. And this was in collaboration with Katrin Romberg, 2013. So over to Regina Bittner.
Yeah, thank you so much for this kind invitation, and it's a great pleasure to contribute to this distinguished panel. It is for me also kind of an interesting revision of a wonderful collaboration we had in 2013 together with Professor Partha Mitter, as well as Shreya Chatterjee. She is unfortunately today not available also to join this discussion, and certainly also Katrin Romberg. Let me briefly probably introduce a few of those ideas that brought us together as a curatorial team, and probably also gives you a bit of an idea and sort of impression why such an institution like the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation sort of got engaged in such a remarkable history of that exhibition from 1922 in Kolkata, and tried in a way to revisit these specific sort of transcultural encounter, as we have called it in our exhibition title, under the circumstances of the 21st century. Firstly, probably I should say a few words about the institution. I'm the deputy director and head of academy, and that probably sheds light also on why we as an institution sort of also are very much engaged into those kind of more scholarly discourses about transcultural modernism. I mean, you all probably have in mind the remarkable icon of modern architecture, which is the Bauhaus building in Dessau itself. It is remarkable in regards to a very representation of Western modern architecture, with its glass curtain wall and with its sort of particular concrete structure. And it is in almost every Western-oriented architectural history visualized as one of the milestones of modern Western architecture history. At the same time, the Bauhaus stands in a very historical moment of epistemological uncertainty and crisis, in which the interest for sort of a collaboration with various different international sort of groups of artists and architects was a kind of a fundament for the school's general engagement with the radical reform of education. And from the perspective of different narratives of the 21st century, we urgently need, in order to embrace the new conditions of the 21st century as a very much shaped by transnational sort of migratory movements, by globalization in the case of media as well as trade and economies, we thought it is also an urgent need to revise this very focused history of Western modernism in regard to its own history of transcultural engagements and encounters. So resituating and revisiting Bauhaus historiography is in a way one of our sort of also sort of current interests by engaging with our own heritage and retelling that history in a much broader framework of contacts, of conversations, of dialogues, instead of narratives that are for a long period of time also shaping art and cultural history, that had always a sort of a central perspective on the Bauhaus or even as Western modernism as a center, and then considering actually its influences and a broader scope in various places and regions across the globe. So this very concept of the influence or the import-export ideas that shaped, as I already said, for a long period of time, also the historiographies that had to be revisited, and certainly opens up to a variety of different narratives that might be also create a certain uncertainty in regard to our intellectual territory, but is at the same time very much needed. And as Professor Mukherjee already mentioned in the beginning of the introduction, new concepts of transculturality, of multiple modernities, sort of pops up also in the sort of contemporary approaches towards looking back to our sort of very 20th century modernism. So it's so far actually our engagement with that particular history of that exhibition as a crystallization point sits also in a critical revision of our own, so to speak, historiographies in the plural, was also part of our own self-reflection on what sort of basics of scholarly as well as, so to speak, heritage studies we are sort of telling our stories. Meaning also critiquing sort of the canonic, more homogeneous sort of system Bauhaus and opening it up towards a variety of different perspectives. And so far, actually, that very little sort of particular history of that 1922 exhibition was a point of departure. And certainly we were not the first ones. So Partha Mitter gave in his speech in 2009, this was the 90th anniversary of the Bauhaus, a conference in Berlin, already a talk, and the publication aftermath of that sort of conference sheds also light on that particular moment. So it was a sort of a moment where we all thought, yeah, there is this knowledge, but at the same time, probably it is worth also to create out of this fascinating knowledge also an attempt to interpret or reconstruct. I'm not sure how shall I describe these attempts to sort of engage with that exhibition and make a reconstruction of that exhibition out of that. So what we undertook together with Katrin Romberg, Partha Mitter and Shreya Chatterjee, it was really a journey searching for trajectories, episodes and evidences of that exhibition. Since there's just one photograph left, which shows the Stella Kamrish, the curator of this 1922 exhibition, surrounded by the male figures from the Indian Society of Oriental Art and a lot of other sort of people that were more engaged with the Kolkata Governmental School of Arts and Crafts and so forth. So this photograph was one of the evidences of this particular moment in history. We found evidences in Weimar archives. We found a few traces in the Shantinikan archives and as well as in the archives of the Jarasanko House in Kolkata. Partha Mitter contributed with his own private collections. We collaborated with the National Gallery in Delhi. So it was really a kind of across different countries and across different museums and archives, search for evidences, but also search for traces of people that were engaged in that, a search for media that was part of it, a search for aesthetic debates about a new visual culture. So in our sort of process, and we thought also we should make this process also visible in the exhibition itself. So the exhibition was not only about literally reconstructing what was taking place at the Samavaya Mansion in Kolkata in 1922, but it was also an exhibition that sort of showed and presented also the entangled networks of cities, large cosmopolitan places, with their intellectual circles of several institutions that were part of that intellectual circles, but also actually an attempt to show artistic approaches, and at the same time, and this is certainly the core of this very idea of the exhibition, the particular reform schools that were sort of the basic formed the basic understanding of this particular reform of a new art that should be much more closer to the sort of conditions of everyday life. So the very notion of avant-garde was certainly also a notion that was related to this strive for new collaborations between art and life, researching also for a new visual aesthetic that is on the one hand under the European conditions or the German conditions, also an articulation against the dramatic conditions of the 1920s and 1910s after the experiences of World War I, and at the same time the search for a new visual culture in sort of almost sort of not post, but the search for independence in India was shaped also by these attempts for a new schools, what we have called schools of departure. This meant, on the one hand, certainly the Shantiniketan as a core for sort of our various interests as a reform school founded by Rabindranath Tagore, but also actually the art schools in Kolkata that were so essential for what's been called the Bengali arts. So insofar, our exhibition on the one hand consisted of what we call a documentary space, a documentary gallery space where we introduced, as I already said, 4 cities as kind of cores for this new intellectual milieus that were so essential for these encounters and collaborations, meaning Vienna and London, Berlin and Kolkata, because the 4 were in a way central for this several engagements and several conversations that took place and formed in a way the very background, these metropolitan cultures that were already in the 1920s deeply interwoven with each other, formed in a way the breeding ground for these particular schools and also for this particular artistic articulations that came together in the 1922 exhibition. And within that, certainly particular figures came into play. Stella Kamrish studied in Vienna, but then went to London, and from London she traveled and she got a visa and had the opportunity also to teach in Shantiniketan. So we're talking Rabindranath Tagore founded this in Shantiniketan, this good school, gave in 1921 a talk in Berlin, deeply admired by the Germans for their sort of search for alternative modes of knowing, really adoring this particular figure that appeared as someone fascinating under the circumstances of an economy of shortage and a torn society between different political camps, someone that really sort of proclaims peace under those difficult conditions. We are talking about Kolkata as a core, with the Jorasanko House as a central core for intellectual exchanges, and about actually the Governmental School of Arts and Crafts. And we certainly also have to talk about London as a particular, not only transit city or transit metropolis, when it comes to the friendship between Rabindranath Tagore and Rosenstein, but also when it comes to the Oriental society that exists in London with its very colonial cultural understandings. So these sort of urban metropolises, these urban metropolitan cultures were very, very important for making this exhibition possible. So we brought them into the fore for our sort of documentary space of the exhibition, and we certainly also portrayed the two schools, the Bauhaus, the staatliche Bauhaus in Weimar and then Dessau, and certainly Chantilly-Quétaine as the two schools that were so essential for new thinking of art education in the beginning of the 20th century. And what we did in our gallery space, how we called it, was we did not present the artworks of the European masters of the Bauhaus, Wassily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Lionel Feininger, Gerd Marx, as in a separate space, like it was the case in the 1922 exhibition that Samavaya mentioned. No, but we thought it is quite essential to present actually the works of the Bengali artists like Gaganendranath Tagore, Abhindranath Tagore, or also Sunyana Devi, really in parallel. So we created really dialogues between these different artistic positions, which was, as you can imagine, probably also for the German public, rather something astonishing, very new, irritating to a certain extent, causing misunderstandings, but this was exactly what we were intending, to sort of, in a way, show also the cracks and collisions of a modernity that seems so white, so clean, so pure once you enter the Bauhaus building. Within these kind of conversations, probably also misunderstandings of this particular artistic encounters, some other perspectives on sort of conversations about modernity under the circumstances of global crisis became apparent to the 2013 visitors. And I thought probably I leave it as such for the introduction, and I guess Partha Mitter will certainly add to what I was just at the moment introducing to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Regina, for this.
Sorry, Professor Mukherjee, how long would you like me to speak?
Maybe around half an hour.
Okay, right.
Okay.
Sorry, I've not read that.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Regina, for placing the Bauhaus legacy within the contemporary frame and also underlining the need to revisit that moment from the concerns of today via historiographies in the plural, which I like the term, reform of art pedagogy, and also the new visual aesthetics, and thereby opening up the Bauhaus legacy to the scrutiny of the present. May I now turn to our second speaker, who is none other than Partha Mitter, who hardly needs an introduction, so to speak. He is Honorary D.Litt from Goethe-Institut, London University, and is Emeritus Professor in Art History, University of Sussex, member of Wolfson College, Oxford, and Honorary Fellow, Victoria and Albert Museum, London. As writer and historian of art and culture, he specializes in the reception of Indian art in the West, as well as in modernity, art and identity in India, and more recently in global modernism. He's held several fellowships, especially the one at Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, Getty Research Institute, Los Angeles, Clark Art Institute, Williamstown, Massachusetts, and CASFA, National Gallery of Art, Washington, DC. He was also Radhakrishnan Memorial Lecturer at All Souls College, Oxford. His publications include very widely read Much Maligned Monsters, History of European Reactions to Indian Art, which came out in 1977. And each time I noticed this year of publication, I always tell myself, this was actually a year before Edward Said's Orientalism, which was in 1978. Then his next publication was Art and Nationalism in Colonial India, 1850 and 1922, Occidental Orientations, that was the subtitle, which came out in 1994. Then later, The Triumph of Modernism, India's Artists and the Avant-Garde from 1922 to 1947. So he's actually covered a century of art. He's written numerous articles in various international journals, including Bauhaus in Calcutta, in Anne-Marie Yegi's edited Bauhaus Global, Gesamtwelt Beitrag der Conference Bauhaus Global. He also contributed to exhibition Das Bauhaus in Calcutta in 2013 and has been advisory to Stiftung Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen in Düsseldorf on global modernism. May I invite Professor Partha Mitter to start his presentation.
Thank you very much, Parul. That's very kind words. And it's a pleasure to be here. And Regina, you've been very gracious in describing some of my work. Thank you very much. There's so much interactions that have been going on. Let me just, Regina, you have sort of presented the whole kind of our background and the exhibition really in a masterly fashion. Let me try and in some ways ask, in some ways, wider questions and come back to some of the issues of Bauhaus. Excuse me. So we are the last, well, I would say about 20 years in seeing the whole process of decolonization globally. And so one of the most important aspects of this has been decentering modernism. Modernism is often seen as entirely European, and only because of kind of, modernism's kind of, you might say, generosity that non-Western countries and cultures, they gradually were allowed access to the whole discourse of modernism. But in fact, what I want to try and stress today, tonight, that it's very much an interactive process. But let me start by going back to some of the issues and also going back to the genesis of the Dessau exhibition. Now, this whole process of decolonization has been going on for quite a while. And it actually began in 1977, 78, my book, Edward Said's book, and so on. And it's been a long process. Now, I was quite taken by surprise when I had an invitation from the Bauhaus Foundation in Berlin, the Bauhaus Global conference, and I was asked to give a paper. I realized this is because I had discussed the 1922 exhibition of the Bauhaus artists alongside the Bengal School in Calcutta and some of our mansions. Now, so that's how it started. And then that's where I first time suggested that we mustn't look at Bauhaus simply as entirely a process whereby Bauhaus ideas are transmitted to the rest of the world that actually very passively receives it. I stress this interactive process and also taking the 1922 exhibition as a pivot, and particularly the figure of Rabindranath Tagore. Rabindranath, of course, was a cosmopolitan figure, very important. And so that's how it started. And of course, then Regina invited me to be part of the Dessau exhibition. And we worked together on this show. And I was very grateful to be part of that. And it continued with finally 2019, really is the birthday of the Bauhaus Foundation in Weimar in 2019, and that's celebrated all over the world, I would say. And that's the great change with this publication, Bauhaus Imaginista, being published. Now, there's no question, and I'm a great admirer of Bauhaus. Bauhaus has been very, very influential in our modern world in showing us a lot of things in terms of design and architecture and so on. Its presence is everywhere. But at the same time, there is that interactive aspect. Now, I want to make a distinction between the artists of the Bauhaus, the teachers and the students, great figures like Paul Klee, Vasily Kandinsky, and so on. They were extremely modest, and when they showed in Calcutta, they didn't show it from the perspective of a dominating culture, talking about art to the colonized people. They looked upon this whole thing in a much more equal way. And in fact, from the early 20th century at least, Germans and Indians, and particularly Bengalis, had a very, very interesting and long connection in exchanging ideas, and various peoples as well, traveling back and forth. And this is partly because as we Indians wanted to get away from the whole colonial situation, let's say Britain and India, so Germany offered a very welcome relief. Now, I want to make a distinction between Bauhaus artists and that period, the whole movement, and art history, the whole discourse. Now, when you read about modernism, often it is said that 1922 is the high tide of modernism. There are famous, publications like James Joyce's Ulysses, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and various other things that happened in 1922. Now, if we think carefully, which we all and Regina, the catalog published of the 2013 exhibition, I think rightly asserted that this 1922 exhibition was the very first transcultural event. And if you look around the world, there is no other exhibition this time that presents the West and non-West on fairly equal terms. And yet, this particular exhibition was forgotten for many years. And I would claim that the exhibition at Dessau probably made people aware a lot more of the kind of exchanges, of these ideas, and the idea that modernism is it's a process of constant learning from one another. It's very interesting that colonialism, colonial rule, European expansion in the 19th century led to communication revolution, massive revolution, publications. Well, first of all, Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal introduced, I call it, hegemonic languages in the colonized regions. But how were these ideas transmitted or circulated? That was through print technology, which I have called virtual cosmopolitanism, which allowed center and periphery come much closer together. And that's when you see that all the ideas of modernity or modernism began to circulate globally. So this is the background to how modernism developed. And not only modernism, if we take the wider issue of modernity in general, a lot of the knowledge, subjects of knowledge, science, arts, they're always seen as going from West to areas outside the West. But if you look carefully, in fact, if you think of Cubism, for instance, a very important example, Picasso is until recently seen as totally a Western artist, but think of how much African art he incorporates. So this is the background I just wanted to tell you about. So let's go back to the actual 1922 exhibition. It's quite interesting. Rabindranath Tagore was, as Regina mentioned, absolutely admired, adored in Germany. He was absolutely on everyone's lips, as it were. So it's interesting, Bauhaus was in Weimar first. On 7th of May, 1921, in Weimar, Rabindranath Tagore's birthday was celebrated at the National Theatre with a recital of poems and songs. And this was quite an important event. So, interesting enough, I originally had argued that Rabindranath Tagore has directly suggested, so was responsible for the 1922 show. But I think I've been shown, others have mentioned that in fact, Kramrisch was the curator and a very important figure in organizing the exhibition. But there's no question that Tagore was the inspiration behind it. And, Kramrisch came to Shantiniketan because of Tagore. And so there's that aspect which is very important. Now, in a way, this is very interesting because what happened in 92 in Calcutta? Think of Calcutta, a remote part in Asia, let's say, a colonized India, very, very far from the center of modernism, the avant-garde, Germany, France. And so why should these artists show in Calcutta? Well, first of all, I mentioned Tagore, but Kramrisch was very committed to it. But far more important, as Stella Kramrisch, this is the art historian who taught at Shantiniketan, in her catalogue to the 1922 exhibition, stresses the fact that the artists of the Bauhaus, particularly Kandinsky and Paul Klee, and of course others, and the artists of Bengal School, Abanindranath Tagore, and then Nandalal, Ashit Haldar, and the rest of the group. What was common between them? Well, they all were rebelling against academic naturalism, academic art, which was the actual cultural basis of colonial rule, colonialism. So that's very interesting. That is something which they shared, and Kramrisch was right to point out. So this is one of the reasons why this show, in a way, between Germany and India was, I think, quite a considerable success. Now, but there are other aspects to it as well, which I want to quickly mention. One of the things which I found by studying it more closely, Walter Gropius. Gropius was the founder of the Bauhaus School of Art in Weimar, School of Art, Architecture and Design. And his manifesto drew inspiration from William Morris's arts and crafts movement that sought to return to the medieval guild system. Gropius was deeply disillusioned by the war, and he came back to Germany, and he was determined to reconstruct the culture. And he talks about it. which is very interesting. Not only medieval guild system, there are other things too. He talks about how craftsmen, artists were craftsmen, could integrate into the whole social system. And if you look at the parallels with Rabindranath Tagore, there's no, I would warn you against thinking about influence or even link. Gropius and Tagore never met each other, but it's quite interesting, and I find it quite uncanny that Tagore's holistic anti-academic ideals were very similar to those of Gropius. He was against colonial teaching. He wanted to have a holistic anti-academic education of, well, as he called it, integrated life, inspired by ancient Indian values. And that resonated with Gropius' notion of organic equilibrium and the essential oneness of all things. Excuse me. Now, I have to also mention that this was only the first phase of Bauhaus. And this early 1920s, when Gropius had the assistance of great painters, Vasily Kandinsky and Paul Klee, and their ideas were very powerful in molding the first, early classes of Bauhaus. It all changed a little later on when, Klee had to resign. They all left, and then Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Hungarian, brilliant modernist, introduced totally a kind of mechanized industrial design. And that's very much part of modernism, and Gropius changes ideas. But this early period is very interesting. Johannes Itten, another one, was deeply interested in Tagore and Eastern philosophy. Then Kandinsky talks about spirituality in art. He was very interested in yoga and very similar things. And as well as, Klee was slightly more ambivalent, but still he was deeply interested in Eastern culture because it allowed him access to another culture. If you look at his early works, there are some, one particular one inspired by the Narasimha, the Vishnu Narasimha figure, and where he actually uses Indian ideas in his painting. So he is very much open to these ideas and trying to find a new expression by looking towards the West. Why were they looking towards the West? Not because they were totally wanted to be influenced necessarily by it, but it allowed them access to new ideas. So this was the very interesting early period of the Bauhaus. Klee, Kandinsky, Gropius, they were all interested in relating artists to, in some ways, more spiritual ideas, or you might say, ideas of social cohesion. And that's something, of course, Shantiniketan deeply believed in. So finally, I'll just end quickly to say, so what was happening globally? You see, global transmission of modernism didn't travel in one direction, but it was a complex dynamic process in which the West and the rest of the world intersected with one another. Of course, because of the imbalance of power between the West and non-Western cultures, non-Western avant-garde remains under the radar in art historical discourses. But this is changing, and I think I would believe that Bauhaus, his exhibitions, the conferences, right from 2009 to 2019 was a very important, era that made substantial contribution to the furthering of decentering of modernism, decolonizing it. Thank you. I'll end it here, I think.
Thank you, Professor Partha Mitter, for this absolutely stimulating presentation. May I request the other speaker, Regina, to also switch on her, so that we can have a discussion. Thank you. So thank you, Professor Mitter, for such a thought-provoking presentation that has wide-ranging implication for rethinking many disciplinary parameters in cultural anthropology, art history, global art history, and especially the Calcutta exhibition has been presented by both of you as an exemplary case of how art history can be reoriented so that we can no longer talk about, this one-way traffic transmission of ideas coming from the West to East, but to see the relationship between the West and East as encounters, as affinities, as kind of shared visions. And both of you have, in your own unique ways, touched upon certain unevenness in this dialogue. Given the time when this exchange was happening, remember it was colonial times, there was a lack of level playing field, so to speak. So perhaps it's against this background of colonial imperialism that the modern, especially the modernism of Bauhaus, was likely to be seen as a freer alternative to the repressive colonial art institutions and pedagogy. I'm going to start with, some questions to just get into discussion. So to Regina, you talk about Tagore's appeal. Both you and Professor Mitter talk about Tagore's enormous appeal in German society at this time, which was kind of war-torn. I was wondering, is it possible to view this more critically through the lens of exoticism? And also you talked about something which is very interesting on irritation of some members of the public. Because I think it's important to register this. If we are not going to succumb to hagiography of Rabindranath Tagore, already there's so much of that. So perhaps one can go against the grain by talking about this as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. And if I may build on that really brilliant introduction and talk by Partha Mitter in regards to hagiography. I mean, there's also a Bauhaus hagiography, one has also to say that. And it is quite interesting also to see how specifically the centenary has helped also to crack, at least to scratch a little bit more on that hagiography, and the ones that has heavily contributed also a constant sort of redefining of this hagiography, meaning also its prominent male figures, like Gropius. But this is another story. But going back to Rabindranath Tagore, I mean, there were also that's what we have been also shown in the exhibition in German magazines like Simplicissimus, a lot of caricatures that were drawing a rather ironic picture on this German public admiration of Tagore. But at the same time, one always has to sense this particular historical moment that was really shaped by despair and disorientation and uncertainty in the circumstances of a post-war Germany, within which someone comes in that instead of talking about conflicts and crisis, just praying peace. And I think that was something which was on the one hand shocking, irritating, but at the same time releasing or giving a perspective. What we did also in the catalog as well as also in the exhibition was to shed a bit more light on that encounters between Germany and India, as also Partha Mitter has emphasized in his talk. And in one article that Chrisman Yapra, also a scholar, has written about the students, the Indian students in Berlin in the 1920s and its diaspora they have formed, and its sort of particular communities that has been established in the 1920s also in relation to, so to speak, governmental attempts on the sort of international affairs. Benoy Kumar Sarkar has organized an exhibition about Bengali paintings at the Kronprinzenpalais in Berlin. As Partha said, it was super interesting to see how Germany, also looking for new allies under the circumstances of being heavily bashed by the Europeans, finding then also partners in India and bridging insofar sort of so one can even say the early independent movement sort of activists that had also a stand in Germany and bringing them into a wider public. So that's why I think this dispersed geographies, these traveling histories, these different migratory sort of elements that were part of this carpet within which actually this exhibition formed the crystallization point. This was also something one could certainly extend, sort of just, having this spotlight on this particular historical moment where you see constantly interwoven networks of activities, of commonalities, of reciprocal ties, of conversations, and certainly also diversity. And this is the other point I thought I would like to make, that is, despite, this commonalities that also the visitors in 1922 discovered, and Stella Crummish emphasized a lot in her introduction, that really sort of the Indian public should really look into that. Really sort of European art doesn't mean naturalism, but rather in a completely new visual culture that was so essential for departing in India from this colonial regime of this British formed arts academy. So giving art a new sort of positioning within the society as something meaningful. So building on their own traditions that existed already in the aesthetics. And more than I, much more than I in regard to that. But I do remember another text by Stella Crummish that linked also to this question of diversity, of empowering alternative articulations in the arts, that was related to the drawings by, to the paintings by Rabindranath Tagore, where she wrote, "This is the situation in modern town, an incoherent population, an imported British civilization on Indian soil." And then she said, Rabindranath Tagore, this is the painter that remembers the Indian and the Bengalis to remember themselves, where they came from. And this was in a way super interesting to see that this exhibition even has stimulated a search for alternative articulations. So meaning this, commonalities, but also emphasizing on different articulations towards actually the dynamics of modernizations. They were certainly also super problematic and crisis-driven. So this is what I found I would like really to put emphasis on. Yeah, and in regard to the last question that you sort of posed, Professor Mukherjee, I confess also that this exhibition in Germany was disputed. And I remember just, not sort of exactly, but there was one in one sort of newspaper, sort of reference towards, I think it was even a sort of a critique on the way how we were sort of creating this dialogue between these different artworks. And then even by, I think this reviewer was sort of a formulation that was a bit referring to, we often know from sort of the art history prior to that, which was about trying to be Picasso, in a way under this Western superiority to claim, they're copying, but they are not able to reach this. And it was in a similar tone in this newspaper in Germany in 2013, which I found really astonishing. So critiquing that the level of abstraction was not reached by these Indian painters. So meaning again, this cultural superiority of the West, looking into sort of, so I thought it's a complete misunderstanding of the whole story, but this is also important to raise those kind of disputes within the public. Thank you.
Thank you. And to Professor Mitter, your assertion that you made in your presentation about 1922 as being the high tide of modernism and the Bauhaus exhibition in Calcutta being the first transcultural event. So I was wondering to what extent you base your own periodization of the Indian modern on this moment. And I was also wondering, can we have a single point of emergence of modernism in India in a culture which is so heterogeneous? So what is your take on that?
Thank you, Parul. Well, that is one of the problems with India. It is so diverse and so heterogeneous. We are always limited by our experience. And I'm afraid it's often the art historian who decides what to It's the tyranny of art historians, which is a pity. But, you know, for a long time, Bengal was seen as the great leader, which is, I don't think it's a realistic thing, but because other parts of India were not so well known. And if I may say, I mean, with my two books, I've tried to redress the balance by shifting the focus to Bombay, to Ravi Verma, and to Andhra, and so on. And it is very important. So you're right. So we need to know more about how modernism, perhaps in art, as well, of course, in literature, was received by, let's say, Maharashtra, or, you know, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, you know. I must confess, I don't, you know, read the languages, so I don't know, but that's why you're there to enlighten us on that. But you're right. But on the other hand, you see, we are always thinking also India as India. So it's the kind of Indian, colonized India, looking at the, you know, the world of, let's say, the metropole, you know, metropolis. So that there is that relation. I don't think basically I think personally, I feel that we need to fill in the gaps. We need to gradually begin to enrich our experience. But the actual method I suggested that we need to still look at this as how did we respond to the West and how did the West respond to us? And that's an interesting issue. You see, talking about that, Regina, you mentioned something very interesting, the response in 2013 of the show and that sort of thing. See, this is a great problem, and that is happening slowly, but I must say a lot of the, can I say, mainstream art historians don't look at it at all. I was very, very, very happy that BAUHAUS did that. It's a very mainstream, but BAUHAUS Foundation didn't rest on its idea that, oh, it's all, you know, modernism and innovation. And yet another thing, it was very innovative. It showed the way, in a way, to the 20th century and the world. And I think it's very important. But this whole business, I call it the Picasso-Mukherjee syndrome. If you copy too faithfully, then you are, if you ape Western modernism, you know, you're sort of aping it. If you can't copy properly your Picasso-Mukherjee, you really can't, you know, be as good as the colonized artist can't win. Either way, if the copy is too faithful, it's, you know, total ersatz, total kind of false thing. As W.G. Archer said, you know, oh, Cubism by Gauguin is absolutely, he rubbished it, in other words. So on the other hand, if you can't copy it properly, no, he said it's imperfect. So anyway, so this is a problem we're all grappling with. I mean, Parul, you're doing that, I'm doing that, Regina, we all kind of, in that sense, are part of that whole debate. But there's a whole lot of people who are not interested in this. It's interesting.
If we can take on, you know, questions from the floor. If not, I've got a couple of more questions which I'd like to raise. I will wait for some questions to come up here. You know, in your presentation, Regina, you referred to the presence of women artists who are kind of related to the male artists, like Gauri Banjo, she's Nandalal Bose's daughter, Sunaini Devi, she is Gauguinath Tagore's sister, Pratima Devi, Tagore's daughter-in-law. So I was just thinking, to what extent do we see this as tokenism? Or because in current discourse on feminism in Indian art, there is a tendency to hark back to the moment and to reclaim these artists as beginning of feminist art, which I think is very problematic. Would you like to reflect on that?
Well, this is very similar, I would claim, and was also a very, very core topic within the centenary in regard to rewriting the Bauhaus historiography. So the sort of looking much more into also the history of the female students and masters at the Bauhaus that was considered by art historians, cultural historians as a gap that hasn't been filled yet. But I confess also, and so I'm very happy to hear this from you, and again, our commonalities are there, because I thought also that often actually the arguments that were formulated against the Bauhaus and its very sort of gendered spaces were driven by a very contemporary perspective on feminism, and to a certain extent even obscured the particular progressiveness and emancipatory conditions that such a school had. So, and by doing so, to a certain extent, and it applies very much to the way how, for example, also in the popular media, as well as in some novels that has been written in the 2019 or has been published, then the weaving workshop was portrayed. And I found it sometimes really annoying from my perspective, because in a way, they repeated in the way how they constantly were writing about the weaving workshop as the only refuge for women. They in a way were manifesting actually this female arts, sort of female crafty sort of realm. But with a more detailed look into the history of the weaving workshop, one could even understand it in a very different way by seeing how intensively these female weavers were engaged in a way radically sort of transforming their own profession and becoming, they were rejecting the position as a weaver that is just engaged in European gobelins and tapisseries, just constantly under the superiority of, so to speak, the visual arts, just, being still in the realm of the applied arts and working in a more decorative manner. And when one looks more in depth into specifically then also the Dessau weaving workshop, these women were really renewing their profession as textile designers, inventing a new profession under the circumstances of that particular female weaving workshop. And this was overlooked and obscured in these descriptions. By doing so, constantly in a way encapsulating these poor women again into this, so to speak, feminine craft space, which was, I think, not the case at all. So you see what I mean, that there are certain problematics within sort of those attempts that in a way creates then another sort of problematics within the historiography. So I do share what you have described. One has to be here also very precise and more sort of detailed. And what we did, for example, as you introduced me also as someone that had really the great pleasure to curate with two other colleagues together our first permanent collection presentation in Dessau in the new museum. And we did a lot of effort to bring up female positions in the carpentry, in the architecture department, in the photography department, and certainly in the metal workshop with Marianne Brandt. So we put a lot of effort to say, well, this kind of description of the Bauhaus has certain limits. And I guess it was well received by the public. But I think this is something, where we constantly also struggling. And so far, I think the conditions you described for Sunyani Devi or some other sort of Indian Bengali artists, female artists, has a lot of similarities. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So, Professor Mitter, I was really very, I found your take on academic art very perspective when you said that academic art as the cultural basis of colonialism, because that was a time when naturalism as a category was used as a stick to get at Indian art, for having not proper naturalism, for having, lack of proper anatomical understanding of human body, not having ability to expose emotions, also lacking the category of fine arts. So the whole question of naturalism becomes actually very important in this whole debate. It also reminded me of the way in which, Regina, you referred to Stella Kramrisch, who was actually also using the same plank to tell the Indian artists that, look, do not get so overwhelmed by this critique of lack of naturalism, because you don't have to have it. Look at modern art, which was seen as a liberating impact. So I think that was very, very fascinating for me. So would you like to add your comments to this?
Parul, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one thing I just wanted to go back to, Regina. I mean, you're right about Bauhaus. Bauhaus Imaginista actually brought out the aspects of women and LGBTQ, and that was one of the very important aspects of the final kind of conferences of Bauhaus Imaginista as a concept. No, but I mean, naturalism, it's very interesting. British rulers said that, Mughal art or Rajasthani art was, yes, very elegant and pretty and, beautiful in its own way, but they could never come up to the standards of history painting, of Victorian history painters, so that was the great difference. And what did they say? That Indian art was decorative as opposed to Western art. But decorative didn't mean simply decoration. What it meant was two-dimensional form. You see, that's interesting. So Abhinath reversed it by saying that spirituality consists in decorative art. In other words, we are rejecting illusionism, rejecting academic naturalism, because that is absolutely linked to colonial capitalist system. In fact, there's a lot of that kind of link with capitalism. It's very interesting. So you then have this radical alternative view. And similar things were being said by Kandinsky as well, and so that's why they had certain interesting intersections, I would say. It was never developed, unfortunately, but that's because of lots of things. And then the war intervened, lots of other things. One anecdote I must mention quickly. This was because of the curator at the Munich Museum of Modern Art. It's wonderful. He sent me this information, which is amazing, that Tagore's paintings were, one painting was found in the stacks where you had all the degenerate art, and it was degenerate art. And I'm very glad Tagore was honored with that same category. So they found it so they were quite, and he sent it to me. It's very interesting. So Tagore was seen as a kind of very similar in spirit. So
interesting, yeah. So Professor Mitter, you also talk about the need to have a new methodology to grasp the active agency of the recipient.
yes.
And you also refer to, I think, in one of your earlier articles, you refer to Bakhtin, Gadama's Fusion of Horizon. But when you read the contemporary reviews written of the exhibition, Bauhaus exhibition of 1922, which got published in Rupam in 1923, it's very easy to read between the lines and notice this anxiety of derivative discourse. It was already there. So I think
this is what O.C. Ganguly you're thinking of, yes.
This one is, I think, anonymous, who says that
yes.
Who says that it's of course it's very important and vital for us to acknowledge the importance of Western ideas, but at the same time we have to stand our ground and retain our Indian identity. So I was just thinking that today we talk a lot about derivative discourse, but it can be traced back to that very moment, which was seen as liberating. At the same time, there was that sense of anxiety.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about that, of course.
Right. So do we have any more questions, or would you like to interact with each other? And Professor Mitter and Regina, would you have questions for each other? We could use this for that.
We have just received a very nice compliment from Professor Shupriya Chaudhary. Just wanted to say that. that she said. It's an excellent discussion. Please
Thank you.
carry on, Regina.
Thank you very much for this compliment. There's one aspect that crossed my mind while part of us was speaking, and this is this what you've called part of this virtual cosmopolitanism. And I think this notion, and this is probably also referring to Professor Mukherjee's interest in terms of methodologies and approaches towards these phenomena. And I think what we found, and this leads also to another fascinating scholar from Kolkata that also contributed to the catalogue, Tapati Gupta, where she has put a lot of emphasis on the intellectual circles as well as the book production and these new means of publishing, sort of the new artistic productions that exist in the Bengal, in Bengal. And I do remember Partha's wonderful collection of these albums. So as a mean and as a media to disseminate into the public this new visual culture, this new aesthetic. And I think similar things could be said from the 20s, but how powerful and important actually the role of the new media, not only for the whole Bauhaus school was, because they were really addressing these transformation within their architecture, within their design, within the new understanding of the arts. But I think this could be also a very interesting aspect for this dialogues towards the 21st century. So what Appadurai called the power of imagination. So to what extent is images, the imaginary, in German it's called Einbildungskraft, so to what extent this sort of stimulates fantasy, stimulates empowerment, stimulates ideas for alternative modes of life. And they are nowadays certainly to completely different scales sort of disseminated across the globe and are available with all of its problems and pitfalls. But I think this dimension is something I think that is also essential for this very early context. So that is how it was embedded into a new media culture, and a new culture of visuality, and how it has even helped to open this up to a wider public, to get people involved. And as you said, as a social project, yeah, that means arts become again meaningful as a social project. I think this is something I've drawn from your virtual.
You're absolutely right. No, but you're absolutely right about that. Yeah, of course. And other thing I was thinking about in Bengal, for instance, very few people actually were able to see the exhibition naturally, because it was in a kind of, can I say, upper class area or kind of westernized area, Park Street. But these very important, famous Bengali illustrated monthlies, they published reviews and pictures, and that's how often the ideas were disseminated. So you're right about the role of imagination and the role of publication in furthering this. Absolutely. This is Bharat Barsho, Mashi Boshumathi, all these kind of famous journals.
I would like to take up the virtual cosmopolitanism, which Regina has mentioned, where I think it's a term which has been coined by Professor Mitter, where ideas travel, but not the works. So would the Bauhaus show then be considered as an example of its opposite concept of the real cosmopolitan, where there's a real encounter? Would it make sense to see it as a real encounter as opposed to the virtual cosmopolitanism, which you talk very evocatively about how in those days it was just not possible for people to travel, whereas the magazines reached instead of people, and therefore it was through the second-hand literature that a lot of people in India got to know about Western modernism. But whereas when you talk about the Bauhaus, it's really, which is perhaps the reason why you're referring to it as a unique event. But almost for the first time, you actually have the works arriving and being watched rather than there. But if I go by the more recent exhibition, perhaps there was no such hierarchy created between reproduction and original, right?
I think this is also a very important point that, I mean, and this is also the contradiction of that show, as Partha already put emphasis on. It was certainly in a very upper class circle. It was certainly also within the sort of Indian, what was the Oriental, the Society of Oriental Art, in the Society of Oriental Art, so within also a particular group of actors and, you know, people that were very much into a particular network. So I think our means and our self-understanding also of cultural institutions, of art institutions, has changed radically. So we do have a completely different concept of the way how we create exhibitions, how we think about participation within our cultural projects. That's not only applied into the contemporary art sort of biennales and documentas and whatever events, but this is also now affecting the way how also sort of rather art historical exhibitions are made. And I think Bauhaus Imaginista is a wonderful example for that. Also, I think I do remember my wonderful colleagues. She unfortunately passed already away. Maya van Osten was one of her major attempts to say, well, the exhibition is not so important. What is much more important are the discussions, the meetings, the symposiums, the talks, the conversations, This is the core of the whole project. These traveling correspondences and conversations that this whole project has stimulated. And alongside these conversations, certain whatever installations emerged as a result and as a kind of a processual conversation that manifests in certain tiny little institutions. And so far, I think, I mean, this is probably nowadays the way how we are able, as probably also people that are curators or art historians, trying to make our, also to integrate, to stimulate participation and open it up to a much wider public.
Thank you, Regina. And yes, Professor Mitter.
Yeah. First of all, Regina, thanks. We are thinking of Marianne von Osten here tonight. I mean, she was a great presence, and we all miss her terribly, you know. But one thing, Regina, you mentioned very important. Now the participation is much wider. But 1922, it's not very clear how many people actually saw the exhibition. That's complicated. Either the newspapers like Statesman did publish a review, and interestingly, Statesman says that the famous painter Kandinsky, they didn't know Paul Klee as much as Kandinsky at that time. Very interesting. But I mean, I feel that in a way, modernism in India, development, moved, well, slightly moved sideways. I call it primitivism because it's a kind of anti-capitalist colonial critical modernity. And that's how I see primitivism, not as a kind of, you know, fetish about, I mean, European consumption of African art. And that kind of primitivism affects certainly Indian artists and everywhere else. I mean, not only Kandinsky, lots of other areas. So, but I'm still thinking about it. I don't know. At 1922, how much impact did it have in Calcutta? But one thing is true, it is very elitist, exclusive, except in art, these are not art, these monthly journals with illustrations, they did diffuse ideas a bit more, you see.
So I think this is a good note for us to conclude this very rich session that we've had. And I think Bauhaus Calcutta 1922 is always going to remain open to multiple interpretations. And perhaps we should keep it that way. Thank you very much to both the speakers. And I think we'll conclude the session today. And I think Astrid will take over.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all of you. I could have listened another hour or 2 hours or even more. Thank you, Dr. Regina Bittner. Thank you, Professor Partha Mitter. And thank you, Professor Parul Dave-Mukherjee, also for the moderation. This conversation was a wonderful lesson how art history can be reoriented how modernism can be decentered and decolonized, including also a decolonization of gender hierarchies in art and design. So you really helped us to understand that the transmission of Bauhaus and Western modernist ideas was not a one-way street at all, but on the contrary, that the exchange, influence, and confluence of ideas had been a much more complex and interactive process, and that we should rather understand cultural exchange as a virtual cosmopolitanism, as Professor Mitter put it, and as a social project, as Regina Bittner pointed out. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas and thoughts with us. Our thanks also goes to Mr. Chaudhary and the Indian Museum and to the Ministry of Culture for their support. And I would like to thank the audience for your interest, for joining us today. Our next program will be on Friday, 24th of September. The topic is Bauhaus and Pedagogy towards a tangible pedagogy, Bauhaus, Shantiniketan, and the National Institute of Design, India. Regina Bittner will be with us again, so thank you. We are looking forward to welcome you back again. The session starts at 6:30 p.m. again, and you're all warmly invited. Please join us. Thank you so much, and thank you all for your contributions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.